The full moon hung low over the Montana forest as Mark Thompson guided his ranger truck along the narrow dirt road. The clock on his dashboard read 11:43 p.m., and he was just about to finish his night patrol. After 15 years as a forest ranger, he knew every tree, every bend, and every sound of these woods. That's why the strange blue flash in the distance caught his attention immediately. "That's odd," he muttered, turning his truck toward the unusual light. It definitely wasn't campers. This area was too remote, and the color was all wrong for a campfire. It wasn't the northern lights either. He'd seen those plenty of times, and this was different. As he drove closer, the radio in his truck began to crackle with static. His GPS display flickered and went dark. Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Something was interfering with the electronics, and that never meant anything good in his experience. He parked the truck and grabbed his flashlight and first aid kit, standard procedure when investigating anything unusual. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he noticed the strange silence in the forest. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, nothing. It was as if all the wildlife had suddenly decided to hide. Following the fading glow, Mark pushed through the dense undergrowth. The smell of burnt wood and something metallic filled the air. As he rounded a large pine tree, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, in a small clearing, lay what could only be described as a tear-shaped pod, about the size of a small car. Its silver surface was scratched and dented, with wisps of smoke rising from several spots. "Holy," Mark whispered, his flashlight beam dancing across the strange object. His first instinct was to call this in, but something made him hesitate. Years of working alone in the wilderness had taught him to trust his gut. And right now, his gut was telling him to investigate further. That's when he heard it, a soft moan coming from the other side of the pod. Moving carefully around the object, his flashlight revealed something that made his heart skip a beat. There, lying on the ground, was a woman, or at least something that looked almost like a woman. Her skin was a pale, silvery color that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Delicate patterns of light pulsed faintly beneath her skin, like glowing tattoos that followed the lines of her veins. She was wearing what appeared to be some kind of tight-fitting suit made of a material he'd never seen before, now torn and damaged in several places. As his light fell on her face, her eyes opened. They were entirely silver, with no visible pupils, yet somehow expressing very human pain and fear. She tried to move and winced, clutching her side where a dark, iridescent liquid was seeping through her fingers. "Don't move," Mark said instinctively, kneeling beside her. "You're hurt." The strange woman's hand shakily raised to her throat, touching what looked like a small device attached to her suit. A soft blue light pulsed, and then she spoke in perfect English, though her lips moved slightly out of sync with the words. "Please," her translated voice came through the device, filled with desperation. "They're looking for me. Don't report this. Don't tell anyone. They'll kill me. And then they'll kill you too." Mark looked up at the night sky, then back at the injured alien woman. His training said he should report this immediately. His common sense said this was way above his pay grade. But looking at her injured form, seeing the genuine terror in those strange silver eyes, he knew he couldn't just abandon her. "Can you move?" he asked, already opening his first aid kit. "My cabin's about 3 miles from here. If I help you, can you make it?" The relief in her expression was unmistakable as she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered through the translator. "You don't understand yet, but you're making the right choice." Mark didn't know it then, but that choice would change not only his life, but potentially the fate of 2 worlds. For now, though, he focused on the immediate problem, getting an injured alien woman to safety without being spotted by whoever, or whatever, was hunting her. Getting the alien woman to his cabin had been challenging, but Mark's years of wilderness rescue training paid off. He half-carried, half-guided her through the dark forest, carefully avoiding the main trails. Every snapping twig made them freeze, and every distant sound had her tensing against him. Mark's cabin sat alone on a hillside, surrounded by tall pines. It wasn't much, just a two-bedroom structure with solar panels and a backup generator. But right now, it was the safest place he could offer. As he helped her through the door, the alien woman's legs finally gave out. "Easy there," he said, carefully lowering her onto his couch. The silvery blood had spread further across her suit. "I need to look at that wound." She touched her translation device again. The suit, press here and here. Her shaking fingers indicated 2 spots on the collar. Mark followed her instructions, and the strange material split open along invisible seams. The injury underneath made him wince. A deep gash ran along her ribs, glowing faintly like everything else about her. But despite the alien nature of her biology, he could tell it was bad. "I have a first aid kit, but I don't know if human medicine will work on you," he admitted, opening his medical supplies. "Basic principles are similar," she managed through the translator. "Cleaning, closing, protecting. My body can heal if given time." As Mark worked on her wound, using the supplies from his advanced first aid kit, she spoke again. "You can call me Dawn. It's close enough to my real name in your language." "I'm Mark," he replied, focusing on cleaning the injury. "Want to tell me what you're running from?" Dawn was quiet for a long moment, her silver eyes studying him. The glowing patterns under her skin pulsed slower now, which he hoped was a good sign. "My people," she finally said, "are called." The closest translation would be the advanced ones. "We've been watching Earth for a long time." She winced as Mark applied an antiseptic. "I was part of the observation team. A scientist studying human civilization." "Studying us for what?" Mark asked, though he had a feeling he wouldn't like the answer. "Infiltration," Dawn said quietly. "My people believe Earth would make an excellent colony, but rather than open warfare, they planned something more subtle. Gradually replace key figures in your governments. Guide your species toward submission." Mark's hands stopped working for a moment. "And you disagreed with this plan?" Dawn's expression showed something like a smile, though her alien features made it look slightly different. "I discovered something my leaders didn't want to acknowledge. Humans are remarkable. Your adaptability, your creativity, your capacity for both independence and cooperation. They're unique in all the worlds we've studied." She tried to sit up straighter and immediately regretted it, letting out a small gasp of pain. Mark gently pushed her back down. "I tried to argue that we should approach openly, as equals. But my leaders," her voice through the translator became bitter. "They called me a traitor, ordered my arrest. I barely escaped with the evidence I'd gathered." Mark finished bandaging her wound, his mind racing with the implications. "So there are more of your people out there, looking for you?" Dawn nodded gravely. "They'll be searching the crash site soon, but they won't expect me to be with a human. They see your species as primitive, incapable of handling advanced concepts. It's their greatest weakness, their arrogance." "Well," Mark said, standing up to close his curtains, "their mistake is our advantage. Get some rest. We'll figure out our next move in the morning." As Dawn settled into an uneasy sleep, Mark sat in his old armchair, keeping watch. Outside, a warm summer night carried on as usual, crickets chirping their endless songs. But now he knew that somewhere up there in the darkness, unknown ships were searching, and humanity's future might depend on what he and this alien fugitive did next. Mark woke up at dawn to find his cabin's lights flickering. Through his window, he saw what looked like heat waves distorting the morning sky, except it was only 60 degrees outside. Dawn, who had been resting on his couch, was already awake and looking worried. "They're here," she said through her translator, her silver skin reflecting the early morning light. "Those distortions are their search vehicles. They're using cloaking technology to look like natural phenomena." Mark grabbed his binoculars and watched the strange ripples move across the sky. To anyone else, it might have looked like weird weather, but now he knew better. "How many ships are we dealing with?" "3 search vessels," Dawn replied, slowly standing up. Her wound looked better after a night's rest, the glowing patterns under her skin pulsing stronger now. They'll start with a wide scan, looking for my energy signature. All of my people give off a specific type of energy. It's part of why we glow. As if on cue, Mark's TV turned itself on, then off, then on again. His microwave beeped randomly, and his phone's screen went crazy with static. The search beams interfere with your electronics, Dawn explained. We need to mask my signature, or they'll find us within hours. She moved to the window, careful to stay behind the curtain. Do you have any copper wire? And salt? Lots of salt. Mark nodded. There's wire in my tool shed, and I keep emergency supplies, including salt for winter. Why? Your earth metals, especially copper, can help scatter our energy readings, and salt water creates interference with our scanning technology. It's one reason we avoided your oceans during our initial surveys. They spent the next hour setting up Dawn's protective measures. They ran copper wire around the cabin's perimeter, buried just under the soil. Dawn showed Mark how to create a salt water solution at just the right concentration, which they sprayed around the property using his garden sprayer. The forest works in our favor too, Dawn said, watching the distortions in the sky move closer. All the organic life creates background noise in their scans. That's why they didn't detect me earlier. Too much biological interference. Mark thought about this. So we could use the forest itself as cover. I know these woods better than anyone. There are caves, dense areas, places where even GPS signals get confused. Dawn's silver eyes lit up. Yes, natural features that block or scatter signals would be perfect. Your knowledge of the land might be more valuable than any advanced technology right now. Throughout the day, they watched as the search patterns moved closer. Mark used his ranger radio to listen to confused reports about electronic disturbances and weird weather phenomena in the area. He called in sick to work, knowing he couldn't risk leaving Dawn alone. The real scare came in the afternoon. Mark was checking the copper wire when he saw another heap-like distortion, but this one was moving through the trees, not in the sky. Dawn pulled him behind a large pine just in time. "Ground unit," she whispered, her translator barely audible. "They're getting serious. They'll have scanners that can detect body heat and movement." They stayed absolutely still as the invisible shape moved past their hiding spot. Mark could hear a faint humming sound, like power lines in the rain. After it passed, Dawn explained how the ground units worked. "They're expecting to find me alone, hiding with technology," she said. "They're not looking for human survival techniques. Your ways of hiding and moving through the forest might be our best defense." Mark nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "Then let's give them a lesson in why you don't underestimate humans or their primitive ways. I've got some ideas that might drive their fancy sensors crazy." For the first time since he'd found her, Dawn smiled properly. "Tell me more about these ideas. I think it's time we turned their advanced technology into a disadvantage." Over the next few days, Mark's cabin became an unusual classroom where human and alien knowledge merged in surprising ways. Dawn's wound was healing remarkably fast, the glowing patterns under her skin growing brighter each day. As she recovered, she began teaching Mark about her people's technology, while he shared his knowledge of Earth's wilderness. "Your people's hearing is more sensitive than ours?" Mark asked, watching Dawn wince at the sound of a distant woodpecker. "Much more," she confirmed through her translator. "We can detect sounds across a much wider range of frequencies. It's usually an advantage, but..." She paused as thunder rolled in the distance, her silver eyes narrowing. "But some of your Earth sounds can be overwhelming." Mark thought about this for a moment, then grabbed his old guitar from the corner. "What about music? Different frequencies, right?" When he strummed a chord, Dawn's reaction was immediate. She covered her ears, the patterns under her skin pulsing rapidly. "That's intense," she said. "The vibrations create a very strong response in our sensory system." "Sorry," Mark said, putting the guitar away. But his mind was already working on how this information might be useful. Dawn seemed to read his expression. "You're thinking like a tactical officer now," she said with approval. "Yes, sound could be a weapon against my people. But there's more you should know about our weaknesses." She used her translator to project a simple hologram showing her species' biological structure. "Our enhanced senses make us vulnerable to certain frequencies, not just sound, but light and electromagnetic waves too. It's why we needed special shielding in our ships to study your sun. Your star's radiation spectrum is particularly challenging for us." Mark took notes as Dawn explained more about her people's biology. He learned that their glowing patterns weren't just beautiful. They were part of a complex system that helped them process energy and information. But this system could be disrupted by the right combination of frequencies. "That's why the copper wire and salt water work," Dawn explained. "They create interference patterns that confuse our scanning technology. Our sensors are based on our own biology, so they share the same vulnerabilities." As they talked, Mark shared his own knowledge. He taught Dawn about how animals hide their tracks, how to move silently through the forest, and how to use natural features to mask their presence. "See these deer tracks?" He showed her during a careful walk near the cabin. "They always take the easiest path through the terrain. Your people's ground units probably do the same thing, following the path of least resistance." Dawn's eyes widened at this insight. "You're right. The search units are programmed for efficiency. They'll follow predictable patterns, just like your animals." Their trust in each other grew stronger as they exchanged knowledge. Dawn began to show Mark how to detect the subtle distortions that revealed her people's cloaked vehicles. In return, he taught her how to move through the forest without leaving signs that technology could detect. One evening, as they sat in the cabin reviewing their defensive preparations, Dawn turned to Mark with a serious expression. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly. "You're risking everything. Your job, your safety, maybe even your planet's security. Yet you trust me based on nothing but my word." Mark was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "I trust you because you trust me," he finally said. "You could have used your advanced technology to control or manipulate me. Instead, you're sharing knowledge, teaching me your weaknesses. That tells me more about your character than any words could." Dawn's patterns glowed brightly for a moment. "That," she said softly, "is exactly why I believe humans deserve to be treated as equals. You understand things that my people have forgotten, like the value of trust and the strength that comes from sharing knowledge freely." Their moment of understanding was interrupted by a new sound, a low, pulsing hum that made Dawn freeze. "They're changing their search pattern," she whispered. "They're getting closer." Mark nodded grimly. "Then it's time to put our combined knowledge to the test. Let's show them what happens when they underestimate humans and their primitive ways." The confrontation began at sunset. Mark's radio crackled with reports of strange lights and electronic failures throughout the forest. Dawn stood by the window, her silver skin glowing dimly as she tracked the invisible movements of her people's search vessels. 3 ground units approaching from the east, she whispered through her translator, and 2 more from the north. They've finally figured out the general area. Mark grabbed his backpack, already packed with their emergency supplies. "Then it's time for Plan B. You remember the route I showed you?" Dawn nodded, her silver eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. "Through the ravine, past the old creek bed, then to the cave system. Are you sure the caves will mask my energy signature? Those caves confused GPS signals long before you arrived," Mark said, checking his equipment one last time. "All that iron ore in the rocks, it's like nature's own shield." They slipped out the back door just as the humming sound grew stronger. Through the trees, Mark could now see the slight distortions in the air that revealed the presence of cloaked alien searchers. He'd gotten better at spotting them over the past few days. Using the skills Mark had taught her, Dawn moved silently through the underbrush, carefully placing her feet just as he'd shown her. They crossed a shallow stream, using the water to hide their tracks. The copper wire and salt water around the cabin would keep the searchers busy for a while, but they needed to move fast. Suddenly, Dawn grabbed Mark's arm. Her patterns pulsed rapidly, a warning sign he'd learned to recognize. Without a word, they both pressed against a large oak tree. Moments later, a ground unit glided past, its cloaking device creating that now familiar heatwave distortion in the air. Mark pulled out his old MP3 player, modified according to Dawn's instructions to emit specific frequencies. He didn't turn it on yet. That was their last resort. Instead, he pointed to a patch of poison ivy ahead. The searchers wouldn't know to avoid it, and their movement through it would leave clear signs for any human tracker to follow. They were halfway to the caves when they heard it, a high-pitched whine that made Dawn stumble. "They're switching to wideband scanning," she gasped. "They're getting desperate." Mark helped her up, noticing how the patterns under her skin were fluctuating erratically. The scan was clearly causing her pain. Without hesitation, he pulled out the MP3 player and pressed play. The effect was immediate. The modified device emitted a complex pattern of sounds, combinations of frequencies that Dawn had helped him select. To human ears, it was barely noticeable, but to the searchers' enhanced senses, it was overwhelming. Through the trees, they could see the cloaked figures stumble. The humming of their equipment became erratic. Mark and Dawn used the distraction to make a run for the cave entrance, hidden behind a curtain of vines. Just as they reached the cave, a beam of intense light cut through the forest behind them. The searchers had switched to visible modes, abandoning their cloaking in favor of brute force scanning. "They're calling for backup," Dawn said, her translator barely audible over the chaos outside. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they bring in heavy scanning equipment." Mark led them deeper into the cave system, following markers he placed earlier. The iron-rich rocks around them gradually dampened the sounds from outside. Dawn's glow provided just enough light to navigate by. "Your 10 minutes just became our advantage," Mark said, leading them through a narrow passage. "They'll need time to set up their equipment, and they don't know these caves like I do. Every minute they spend searching is another minute we can use to." He stopped speaking as Dawn grabbed his arm again. This time, her expression showed not fear, but determination. "Mark," she said, "I think it's time we stopped running. I have an idea. But it's dangerous, and I'll need your help." Looking at her glowing form in the darkness of the cave, Mark nodded. "I'm listening. Let's show them what happens when humans and aliens work together." Deep in the iron-rich caves, Dawn's plan began to take shape. She had removed a small device from her suit, what she called a neural transmitter, and was modifying it with Mark's help. His steady hands, trained by years of wilderness first aid, proved perfect for the delicate work. "Your people's overconfidence is their weakness," Mark said, carefully following Dawn's instructions to adjust the tiny components. "They're so focused on their advanced technology that they won't expect simple solutions." Dawn's silver eyes gleamed in the darkness of the cave. "Exactly. They're scanning for energy signatures, complex equipment, and escape vehicles. They're not looking for—" She paused as her translator searched for the right words. "They're not looking for human cleverness." Outside the cave, they could hear the search teams setting up their heavy equipment. The humming grew louder, and occasional flashes of light penetrated even the deep cave walls. They were running out of time. "Remember what you taught me about animal traps?" Dawn asked, her patterns pulsing with excitement. "About using the prey's own strength against it." Mark nodded, beginning to understand her plan. He reached into his backpack and pulled out several small mirrors he'd brought from the cabin, along with some string and his modified MP3 player. Their own scanning beams reflected back at them, amplified by the cave crystals. "Combined with the disruptive frequencies we discovered," Dawn finished, "and the iron in these caves will create a resonance effect that their sensors can't handle." They worked quickly, setting up their trap. Mark tied the mirrors at specific angles Dawn calculated, creating a complex reflection pattern. The crystals in the cave walls, which normally just looked pretty to tourists, would serve to amplify and scatter the light in chaotic patterns. Dawn modified her neural transmitter to sync with Mark's MP3 player, creating what she called a cascade effect. Each sound and light reflection would trigger more disruption in her people's sensitive scanning equipment. "But we need to get them to use their strongest scanning beam," Dawn said. "The one that would normally cut through any shielding." Mark grinned in the darkness. "Leave that to me. Sometimes the best way to catch something is to let it think it's caught you." He took off his jacket and deliberately scraped it against the cave wall, leaving clear marks. Then he walked heavily toward the cave entrance, leaving obvious tracks in the damp cave floor. Every tracker's instinct he had screamed against it. But that was the point. He was leaving a trail so clear that no advanced species could resist following it. The sounds outside changed. The searchers had found his trail. "They're coming," Dawn whispered, her translator barely audible. "Their arrogance makes them predictable." With the search team unconscious in the cave, Mark and Dawn worked quickly. Using their own equipment against them, Dawn accessed their neural networks and downloaded crucial information about the planned invasion of Earth. Mark kept watch, his modified MP3 player ready in case any backup arrived. Their overconfidence made this too easy, Dawn said, her silver fingers moving rapidly over the alien devices. They never thought to protect against simple signal reflection. Their encryption is designed to stop advanced hacking, not, what did you call it? Hitting it with a rock. Mark grinned. Sometimes, the old ways work best. Dawn's patterns pulsed with amusement as she continued gathering data. "I have everything we need now. Proof of the invasion plans, details of their operations on Earth, even their communications with the homeworld." She paused, looking at Mark seriously. "But we need to be careful how we use this information. Revealing it wrongly could cause panic." Mark thought for a moment. "I might have an idea about that. Being a forest ranger, I have contacts in various government agencies, people who deal with unusual situations quietly." "Can they be trusted?" Dawn asked. "There's one person in particular," Mark said. "My old friend Robert at the Environmental Protection Agency. He handles special investigations, the kind that don't make it to official reports. He's dealt with covered-up chemical spills, secret facilities. He'll know how to handle this." They made their way out of the cave system, leaving the unconscious search team behind. Dawn had modified their equipment to keep them in a safe sleep state for several hours. By the time they woke up, it would be too late to stop what was coming. Mark used a secure line from his ranger station to contact Robert. The conversation was brief but effective. "We have a code green situation," was all Mark needed to say. Within hours, unmarked vehicles arrived at a designated meeting point deep in the forest. What followed was a carefully orchestrated operation. Dawn presented her evidence to a select group of government officials, demonstrating both the threat and her own willingness to help Earth. The proof was undeniable: detailed plans for infiltration, records of already placed agents, and most importantly, evidence of her own people's vulnerabilities. "You understand," one official said after reviewing everything, "this puts us in an interesting position. We can't reveal this publicly. Not yet. But we can prepare." Dawn nodded. "My people's greatest weakness is their belief in their own superiority. They don't expect resistance. Don't expect creativity." She looked at Mark with respect. "They don't understand how humans can turn simple things into powerful tools." The government team proposed a solution that surprised both Mark and Dawn with its simplicity. Instead of a dramatic confrontation, they would use Dawn's evidence to quietly approach her people's leadership. The message would be clear. Earth knew about their plans, knew their weaknesses, and was prepared to defend itself. "But more than that," Dawn added, "show them what I've learned. How humans and my people could work together as equals. Mark and I proved that cooperation is more powerful than conquest." The message was sent through channels Dawn helped establish. The response came within days. Her people's leadership, faced with exposure and the realization that humans were far more capable than they believed, agreed to open diplomatic relations. As for Dawn, she was granted asylum on Earth. The government created a new position for her and Mark, interspecies relations coordinators. Their first task would be helping establish proper diplomatic channels between Earth and her people. "You know," Mark said one evening, as they watched the sunset from his cabin porch, "all this started because you crashed in exactly the right forest." Dawn's patterns glowed warmly. "No," she said, her translator carrying the smile in her voice. "It started because I found exactly the right human, one who proved that so-called primitive wisdom, combined with advanced knowledge, creates something greater than either alone." Above them, the stars began to appear, but now, looking at them, Mark felt not just wonder but hope. Humanity had faced its first real contact with an advanced alien civilization, and they'd won not through superior firepower or technology, but through the simple human traits of adaptability, creativity, and the willingness to trust.